400 years ago, engineers drained an Essex coastline for farmland. In 2015, engineers flooded it deliberately with 3 million tonnes of clay pulled from under London. Last winter, 39,000 birds. That clay didn't come from a quarry or a construction dump. It came from 40 metres underground, cut loose by 8 giant boring machines, chewing more than 40 kilometres of new railway tunnel beneath the streets of central London, on the project that would eventually open to passengers as the Elizabeth Line. Tunnelling that deep for that long produces an enormous problem most people never think about. Where do you put the dirt? A single boring machine can displace enough material in a day to fill dozens of trucks, and Crossrail was running 8 of them at once for years. Someone had to decide in advance where all of that clay would go, and the company building the line had to move it somewhere. Instead of trucking millions of tonnes to a landfill, engineers shipped it down the Thames and out onto the Essex coast to a low, flat piece of land called Wallacea Island, where the River Crouch meets the River Roach, just northeast of Southend-on-Sea. That is the wetland the birds arrived at. Wallacea wasn't always wet. Dutch settlers and English landowners walled it off from the tide centuries ago, turning salt marsh into wheat fields and grazing land. It stayed farmland through wars, floods and falling grain prices, protected the whole time by earthen sea walls that were quietly getting older and weaker. A major North Sea flood in 1953 overwhelmed sea defences across the whole Essex coast, Wallacea included, and the island's population and farming activity never really recovered afterward. By the early 2000s, that was a real problem. Drained peat and clay soil compacts and settles once the water is taken out of it, so the walls weren't just aging, the ground behind them was sinking too. Left alone, those walls were eventually going to fail in an uncontrolled way, and salt water was going to flood the farmland regardless. Just without any plan behind it, doing nothing wasn't actually a stable option. That was the baseline the RSPB, Britain's bird protection charity, walked into when it started buying up farmland on the island around the year 2000. The first breach wasn't Crossrail's. In 2006, the UK government's Environment Department, DEFRA, cut a series of openings into its own stretch of old seawall on the north side of the island, creating a smaller marsh called All Fleets. That project existed for a specific legal reason. Port developments elsewhere on the Thames estuary had destroyed tidal mudflat and marsh, and habitat regulations required someone to replace what had been lost. Wallacea became the replacement site. So part of this story isn't generosity, it's compensation, required by regulation for damage done somewhere else entirely. Worth holding on to, because later, when this project gets called a restoration triumph, it's only partly a voluntary one. The RSPB wanted to go much further than that one government marsh. Its ambition was the whole island. Hundreds of hectares of former farmland turned back into mudflat, salt marsh, lagoon and pasture. A piece of land roughly 5 times the size of what Crossrail's clay would eventually reshape. But turning drained, sunken farmland back into functioning wetland takes an enormous amount of raw material, because the ground first has to be built back up before the tide can safely be let in. Engineers at the time estimated the total fill needed somewhere around 10 million tonnes. The RSPB didn't have that. Crossrail, meanwhile, had almost the opposite problem. It needed somewhere to put spoil, and needed it badly. In 2008, the two organisations signed a partnership. Crossrail would deliver its excavated clay to Wallacea. The RSPB would use it to rebuild the land. The UK's Environment Secretary at the time, Owen Paterson, formally launched construction of the wider reserve, calling it one of the most ambitious coastal nature projects attempted in Europe. And Crossrail's chief executive, Andrew Wolstenholme, later described the arrangement as turning a construction byproduct into one of the company's clearest sustainability results. Those were the two institutions and the two men publicly attached to them that made this a joint decision rather than either side simply solving its own problem alone. The logistics were their own kind of engineering project. Spoil from Crossrail's tunnels moved first by rail and conveyor to transfer points around London, one site at Limo in the east, near Canning Town, another near Northfleet in Kent for material from the western tunnels. From there, it was loaded onto barges, roughly 6 a day, each one carrying about 8,000 tonnes, over the life of the project that added up to around 2,400 shipments sailing down the Thames and around the coast to Wallacea. At the island, the barges unloaded onto a conveyor belt almost a kilometre long, which fed a stacker, which fed a small fleet of about 20 dump trucks that spread the clay across the site. Moving the material by water instead of road removed more than 150,000 individual truck journeys from London's streets. For Crossrail, that wasn't only good publicity. Barging was genuinely cheaper than paying landfill tipping fees for that much material, and it let the company report that roughly 98% of everything it excavated across the whole project was reused or recycled rather than dumped. Getting the clay, there was only half the job. Simply flooding drained land the way DEFRA had done at Allfleets Marsh would have worked at a small scale, but Wallacea's engineers were nervous about doing that at the size they now had planned. Cutting one enormous breach in a seawall is a genuine risk. Fast-moving water can scour a new opening wider than intended, undercut the banks, and damage the very habitat you're trying to build before it has a chance to settle. So instead of one large breach, the design was split into 3 smaller, separately managed realignments, each one easier to model, monitor, and control if something went wrong. In the summer of 2015, engineers cut 3 separate openings into the rebuilt seawall on the eastern tip of the island, and the tide came back into a section that would become Jubilee Marsh, roughly 170 hectares raised and reshaped by Crossrail's clay. A hectare being a bit under 2.5 acres, of which about 115 hectares were open to the sea. Here's the part that didn't make headlines. The day the water came in, almost nothing lived there. The RSPB's own site manager has described those early months as looking more like a construction site than a nature reserve. Bare mud, hardly any plants, diggers and dump trucks still working around the edges, almost no birds at all. That's not a failure, it's just how tidal ecosystems start. Sediment has to settle out of the incoming water and build up over months and years. Salt-tolerant plants have to colonise the new mud. Worms, snails, and small invertebrates have to establish themselves in that mud before there's anything for a waiting bird to eat. Cutting a hole in a seawall creates the physical shape of a wetland instantly. It does not create a functioning one. That gap between the engineering finishing and the ecology catching up is the real middle of this story. The project's success wasn't the breach itself, it was everything that had to happen quietly in the 2 or 3 years after it. The first real evidence that the gamble had paid off wasn't a headline count, it was smaller than that. Within a couple of breeding seasons, redshank were nesting on the new marsh and successfully raising chicks there. Widgeon and black-headed gulls were feeding on the incoming tide, and RSPB staff monitoring the site said openly that they were relieved wildlife had found the place as quickly as their models had predicted, rather than assuming it automatically would. It worked eventually, and the RSPB kept building. A later phase, finished around 2019, used a different engineering approach entirely. Instead of open breaches exposed to the full rise and fall of the tide, this phase used what's called regulated tidal exchange, shallow lagoons fed and drained through controlled sluice gates rather than a permanent gap in the wall. That lets engineers fine-tune water depth and salinity by hand, creating conditions closer to Mediterranean salt lakes than to a typical British salt marsh. The RSPB built it that way on purpose, aiming not just at birds that already use the Essex coast, but at species that don't yet: black-winged stilt, spoonbill, Kentish plover, birds expected to push north into southern England as the climate warms. Part of Wallacea was engineered for arrivals that haven't fully arrived yet. The numbers started showing up in the official counts. In January of 2020, a standard bird survey found nearly 8,000 birds using that new lagoon phase alone, and more than 33,000 across the whole island on the same day. By December of 2023, a survey recorded 52 species and close to 39,000 waterbirds island-wide. And in the winter of 2024 into 2025, on the 10th anniversary of that first breach at Jubilee Marsh, counters recorded a new record. About 39,000 birds overwintering on the site in a single count, including close to 800 avocets, more than 10,000 knot, and roughly 3,000 grey, plover and bar-tailed godwit combined. Those aren't birds that live there year-round. Most are travellers on the East Atlantic Flyway, a migration route running from South Africa and the Arctic down through the North Sea coastline, which means a decision about London railway spoil ended up mattering to birds that spend their summers thousands of miles away. None of this was cheap, and Crossrail's spoil didn't pay for most of it. Moving the clay was Crossrail's cost either way, since it had to dispose of that material somehow. Actually engineering the wetland, the seawalls, the lagoons, the sluice gates, the monitoring was a separate bill, funded mainly by the Environment Agency, RSPB members, and donors and environmental grant trusts, adding up to roughly £70 million across the whole Wild Coast project. Worth keeping those two budgets apart, because it's tempting to credit one £70 million wetland to a single donation of dirt. The clay built the raised ground. It didn't build the sluice gates, fund the monitoring, or pay the staff who spent a decade managing water levels and counting birds. It's also worth being honest about what's still unfinished. Crossrail originally discussed delivering somewhere between 4 and 4.5 million tonnes of material. In the end, roughly 3 million tonnes actually arrived. That shortfall matters because the RSPB's full ambition for Wallacea was never just the hectares Crossrail's clay reshaped. It was a wetland estate spanning some 900 hectares of the island. Large stretches of that wider estate are still grassland or former arable fields, not yet converted to tidal habitat, waiting on funding and fill material that never fully arrived from Crossrail alone. The wetland in the headlines is real and the bird counts are real, but it's a finished piece of a larger, still incomplete plan, not the whole plan delivered. There's a longer-term limitation too, and the engineers built it into the design on purpose. Wallacea sits below sea level, held there by walls and gates that require permanent active management, pumps, sluices, monitoring, maintenance, indefinitely. The shallow slopes built into the newer sea walls exist specifically so the marsh has somewhere to retreat to as water levels keep climbing over the coming decades. That's an admission, built directly into the earthworks, that this wetland isn't a finished, permanent object. It's a managed, moving target, expected to need further rework as the coastline keeps changing. There's a human side to this too, separate from the birds. The reserve now draws close to 25,000 visits a year from walkers and birdwatchers on trails built along the tops of the rebuilt seawalls in a part of Essex that didn't have much public access to open coastline before. Transport for London, which now runs the Elizabeth line, points to Wallacea as part of that railway's legacy, alongside the seats filled and the journey shortened. And the wider stretch of eastern England coastline that Wallacea belongs to, from the Thames estuary up toward Lincolnshire, is now on the UK's official tentative list for UNESCO World Heritage status. The same track record used for places like the Galapagos Islands on the strength of exactly this kind of engineered wetland recovery. What Wallacea does show, clearly, is that a byproduct nobody wanted can become the raw material for something nobody expected. 3 million tonnes of London clay, barged instead of trucked, gave engineers the elevation they needed to safely let the tide back into land that had been kept dry by force for 4 centuries. That raised ground became Jubilee Marsh, the anchor of a wetland complex that other funding, other engineering, and roughly 15 years of patient, unglamorous ecological work then built out further, sediment settling, plants establishing, invertebrates arriving, and finally, birds. Today, brown hares graze the grassland edges. Rare sea aster mining bees have formed several colonies in the dunes, and last winter's count put nearly 40,000 birds on the water at once, the highest number recorded there since the tide came back. That is a real, measured, independently counted outcome. It is not proof that dumping construction spoil automatically builds an ecosystem. It's proof that spoil can become foundation if the people using it also fund the decade of unglamorous water management, sediment monitoring, and species-specific engineering that turns raised mud into a place tens of thousands of migratory birds choose every winter to land. If you want more stories like this one, decisions that quietly reshaped a river, a coastline, or a species' odds of survival, subscribe for the next evidence-led story from The Wild Return.